Hello, folks. Welcome to another edition of Inside the Marble Palace, Postmedia Saskatchewan's look at Saskatchewan politics, which forever has been pretty much a look at COVID. I'm Murray Mandryk, political columnist for the Regina Leader Post, Saskatoon Star Phoenix. Joining me, as usual, Arthur White-Crummey, our political affairs columnist in Regina and Saskatoon. And from Saskatoon, joining me, Zak Vescera. I blew it this week, didn't I?
It's okay. I'll forgive you after some therapy.
Sorry about that, man. Zak is a reporter with the Star Phoenix who specializes in health and has done a ton of COVID, including this week's press conference with Premier Scott Moe that had a very different tone to it, or at least I thought so. What did you hear from Scott Moe this week that you found interesting, Zak?
Typically in the past, whenever Premier Scott Moe or Minister Paul Merriman with the health portfolio have been asked about people who are vaccine hesitant or vaccine refusal, their immediate response is to turn right around and say, I don't think we need to worry about that. I think people will get the vaccine. I think they will do the right thing. What we heard from Scott Moe on Tuesday, though, was a really drastic change in message. He started off the press conference by explicitly talking to people who were refusing the vaccine and people who were encouraging other people to refuse the vaccine. And while he maybe didn't directly insult them, he had a tone that I would say was extremely stern. He said, hey, we're not asking you to storm the beaches of Normandy. We're just asking you to get a tiny needle in your arm. And to people who said that they were exercising their freedoms by not getting vaccinated, he said, no, actually, you're holding this whole thing up for everybody else. What prompted that change in tone? I'm not sure. It could be that now that we're farther on the vaccination campaign, he wants to put the gas down a little bit. Maybe there has been a worrying signal about vaccine hesitancy, but it certainly was not a message we heard from the Premier that explicitly in the past.
You just asked a question I was going to, because I'm not sure what prompted the change in tone either. And I'm especially not sure, Zak, because it was contradictory of other elements of his messaging. He said at the press conference, both him and Dr. Shahab said at the press conference that they're not particularly worried about any specific age group because they see large take-ups in the 60-plus category. They're all now over 80%, and see those who have become more recently eligible for vaccines to be headed in a very positive direction. I guess the question that I am still a little confused by, and I don't know if you have a better answer than I got at the press conference, but who in the hell is he worried about in terms of not getting their vaccines if specific age groups are all in the upper 80% or 80%, or is it the fact that if we're not, unless we're 90 or plus, it is a legitimate worry that people aren't getting vaccines or won't get vaccines?
I think it's an excellent question. And it's true that when asked about it by you, I think Moe did turn right around and say, oh, I'm actually not that worried about take-up. But that doesn't explain why he spent 3 minutes lecturing everyone who was listening on the virtues of getting the vaccine. My best guess might be something that Dr. Shahab mentioned very subtly later on in the press conference, where he implied that whatever happens in the final phase of Saskatchewan's reopening plan will depend on how many people have been vaccinated. He kind of hinted that that will determine how ambitious that reopening stage can be. We obviously have very few details about phase 3 of the plan, which is slated for, I guess, early July. Except that we know that most restrictions will be lifted at that time. What most restrictions are might end up depending on how many people are vaccinated. We know that we need at least 70% of all adults. We're tracking to get well above that. It's possible that Moe and Shahab just want to get an especially high number so they have a good reason to taper down restrictions as low as they can.
This is a good opportunity to bring Arthur in, because you wrote a great piece today comparing what we're doing here, especially to what's going on and has just been announced in Alberta in terms of its reopening plan. From that piece, I think you've probably been able to glean what is working here and what has been done elsewhere, and what we might have to worry a little bit more about in Saskatchewan that maybe we're not thinking about right now. What did you get out of that piece, Arthur, that you really found most interesting in terms of things that Saskatchewan people might have to worry about in terms of reopening, and where they're doing things differently, maybe better, maybe worse than other places?
Yeah, well, whether you consider it, better or worse is really going to depend on where you're coming from and what you were expecting. But it's clear that there is a very wide range between how different provinces are preparing for reopening. I mean, it really ranges the gamut from Alberta at one extreme and Ontario at the other, in my opinion, with Saskatchewan being quite a bit closer to Alberta into Ontario. Ontario is taking a very, very halting pace on this. To be fair, they are, starting out with a lot more restrictions than we are at the beginning of this process, but they're taking into account second doses as they go to stages 2 and 3, just like the federal government was directing. They're being very, very cautious with reopening restaurants, with even letting people gather outside in some cases. It's moving very slowly, whereas Alberta is just firing on all cylinders here. Jason Kenney wants to get people back out for the Calgary Stampede. Yeehaw. Basically, he's chosen to really beat Saskatchewan at its own game. In some ways, the plans look somewhat similar, but we have at least 3 weeks between each stage of our plan here in Saskatchewan, whereas Alberta has chosen to go even more quickly. They're having 2-week gaps if they're able to meet their targets, and their targets are really not that hard to meet. They did add a few more metrics that we didn't have, like hospitalizations, but the hospitalization levels that they're targeting are so close to where they already are that they're almost going to be met automatically just based on the trends that they've already seen with their case numbers. We know that hospitalizations are a lagging indicator, so the fact that their cases have been trending downwards for several weeks now basically means that they're guaranteed to meet that hospitalization target. So I think that Jason Kenney's intention of opening the Calgary Stampede and having all restrictions lifted by the end of June means that Alberta is likely to get fully reopened before Saskatchewan.
Is it really getting into a bit of a contest, Zach, in terms of who gets open first, and where do we have to worry about that? And one place that I'm a little curious about, because it doesn't get mentioned here, is the second dose element. I don't even know where we're at right now, because it's been talked about so little in terms of second doses being all that significant in terms of reopening plans or other things. But I guess the question about getting ahead of ourselves, where are we in terms of compared with other jurisdictions related to second doses? And maybe more critically, where are we in terms of those not getting their first doses? Because it isn't just people that are reluctant to get vaccinations, it's people that can't. And you've done some really good work in this. We talked about this, I think, in past podcasts about First Nations communities, other communities, in terms of new Canadians maybe having less access to it. A couple things here. Tell us about the success in First Nations community, and tell us where the potential problems are in either first and second doses that you've sort of seen in your reporting of late.
Sure thing. Well, maybe to start off, First Nations have from the beginning taken a much more cautious approach to this pandemic. And I think across the country, you're going to see those jurisdictions actually be a lot more hesitant than the general population about reopening. I know that in Saskatchewan, for example, the official advice is for First Nations to not start their reopening process until like 85% of people have gotten the first dose. And you're looking at like 25% who have gotten the second dose. So way, way more hesitant than any other provincial jurisdiction. And that kind of reflects a greater attitude. First Nations have had checkpoints on their reserves to limit who goes in, who goes out. They've had really dynamic contact tracing efforts. They've just been really, really, really stellar at keeping the virus out. We saw that reflected in Auditor General's report that came out yesterday that found that for First Nations people on reserve, their hospitalization rate with COVID-19 was actually around 60% the national average. and their mortality rate was a little over half the national. It was a little below roughly half the national average, give or take. So a real success story there, even though we hear about a lot of really brutal outbreaks happening in places like Saskatchewan's north and in Manitoba. The vaccine rollout has been pretty successful in most First Nations, so I think they're looking pretty optimistic. Now,
what's worked here? It's a great point, because I want to know what's worked here compared with Manitoba, because we all know that Manitoba's numbers are absolutely horrific, or have been horrific for the last 2-3 weeks, while we're registering someplace north of 100 cases in Saskatchewan per day. Manitoba's getting up to the 400 case. And my understanding is that a lot of this is being driven by First Nations problems, specifically on reserve. What's gone wrong there that's gone right here that you know of?
I think they're actually very comparable in a lot of ways. One thing Minister Mark Miller, who's in Indigenous Services on the federal profile, told me yesterday when I asked him about this was that once the virus gets into some of these far northern remote communities, it's really, really hard to get out. And we saw that in Saskatchewan, particularly in December and January and February. We had extremely high case numbers in northern First Nations. They made up a disproportionate chunk of our active case rate, and a lot of communities were extraordinarily hard hit. But now that they've managed to kind of clamp down and get the virus out, people have recovered, vaccinations have come in, it's sort of calm on the northern front. I think what happened in Manitoba is that another wave somehow managed to make its way into those populations, and now we're seeing the obvious consequence of that, which is this brutal tragedy in Manitoba. On your second question that you asked there, Murray, about the second doses, I think that kind of is the big question mark right now. We're still learning about how well a first dose protects versus these people who have the second booster shot. Most people seem to agree that you really, really need that second booster shot, ideally whenever you can get it, especially in light of some of the more aggressive variants of concern. In the United Kingdom, for example, I know that the NHS has moved to actually speed up the administration of second doses for more vulnerable people. Here in Canada, though, we're really hunkering down on that first dose strategy. And in fact, we're even vaccinating people who are teenagers, who are in that 12 to 18 category. We're really focused on getting that even layer of limited protection as best we can. Mo and Shahab have been really optimistic that as vaccine supply continues to improve, we'll see a smaller interval for that second dose. But I think that really is kind of the dark horse here, is whether we do see more infections because of these more aggressive variants and only limited protection in the Canadian population.
Hey, Arthur, how do you think that's playing into the strategy that you talked about in terms of reopening? Because I don't think Alberta talked, or Ontario has talked much about second doses either. Is it something that we're now all supposed to forget about, as per Zach's concern, now that we're opening up? And do you see potential problems down the road if we do, from what you've sort of gathered from some of the things you've been reporting about?
Well, it's clear that the federal government wants us to take account of second doses. I mean, in the PHAC guidelines, I believe to move on to partial opening, they were advising having 20% of people fully vaccinated, and to go further, they wanted 75% fully vaccinated with both doses. Out east, some provinces are following that guidance to some extent, though not exactly. Ontario, as I said, does take account of second doses in their second and third stages, though they don't go all the way up to the 75% level. Quebec, for its final stage, does require 75% of people to be fully vaccinated, and that's not likely to happen until the late summer. So there does seem to be a little bit more caution out east, and a little bit more willingness to follow some of that advice from the federal committee. Out here, as is not atypical, we're going our own way. The premiers are charting their own path. That's true in Alberta, true in Saskatchewan, true in BC. In all cases, it's a first dose strategy in terms of reopening. I don't think we really know enough yet to be sure exactly which of the two is going to be more effective. The preliminary data that we're hearing from here in Saskatchewan is that there's a very low breakthrough rate, as Zach has previously reported, in terms of how many people with that first dose are getting COVID. It's difficult to know exactly what to draw from that, given that there's no randomized controlled study being done in Saskatchewan right now. But it is promising to show that this kind of preliminary coverage with one dose is proving to be quite effective, and that wide coverage might be the way to go, but let's hold our judgment for now.
Is it allowing us to move forward and look at other COVID-related problems? I know you're doing some work in terms of surgical wait times that have been backlogged because of COVID. These are serious issues that we have to start thinking about how to deal with in terms of getting not just Saskatchewan back in terms of recreational activities or even commerce activities, but even healthcare issues that are very critical. What have you been finding out about that, Arthur? And what do you think might be the points of concern for the Saskatchewan Party government in terms of not just reopening, in terms of businesses, in terms of parks, in terms of the riders, in terms of just getting people back in the hospital for doing delayed surgeries?
Yeah, the SHA has had to slow down surgeries on 2 occasions now, in the spring and in the fall to winter, because of the pressures that they were feeling because of COVID, and that's really led to a backlog in terms of surgeries that haven't been performed, and has led the wait list to swell. So this is something that we're going to be talking about for a long time, and that's causing a lot of suffering for a lot of people. Like I've recently gotten the data in terms of how many surgeries have been postponed. These are estimates based on how many they would typically do and how many they've done in and how many they've done behind that over the past year. So there's been 22,000 fewer surgeries since March 15th, 2020 towards April 21st, 2021, compared to a typical year. So these surgeries are still going to be there. These people are still going to have these health needs, and the system is going to have to continue to ramp up in order to catch up on this list. I mean, we're talking about things that can really affect people's quality of life. Knee replacement is one of the most frequently delayed surgeries. Hernias have been delayed in a lot of cases. Cataract is the most common. So it's really something that we're going to have to catch up on.
Zach, this is pretty critical in relation to Saskatoon being a hub for a lot of the health procedures that go on, not just in terms of the northern portion of the province, because it extends well into the north, but in terms of southern Saskatchewan too, because this is where people wind up going, because generally speaking, they have more hospitals and more facilities. So for that reason, we have to pay special attention to what's going on in terms of Saskatoon cases, whether it's finally getting ahead of that COVID third wave. And I sense that it is. It's not doing quite as well as Regina, but that said, it didn't do quite as badly either. Can you speak to why that is and what the outcome might be in terms of being able to see that city move ahead, or see Saskatoon move ahead, as opposed to what we saw in Regina, where we really had to buckle down for a while and look seriously about the restrictions that are going to be lifted tomorrow?
And there's actually a rare good news story here in this age of COVID-19 that I'm pleased to report. A few weeks ago, I reported that Saskatoon's intensive care units were actually looking at further expanding because of the demands from COVID-19 patients, as well as other people in the ICU. That expansion didn't end up happening. They were able to stay put with the resources they had and manage it accordingly, because we didn't see the same kind of insane rise in hospitalizations that we saw in Regina. That being said, Murray, I don't think we're out of the woods quite yet. We still have a higher case rate out in the Saskatoon area than we see in the Regina area at this point. The ICU still has plenty of people in it. Remember that these new COVID variants are infecting younger patients who often have a long fight in the ICU. And that's a good thing, because they're able to fight for longer and they have a higher chance of surviving potentially, but it means that they are in a bed for many weeks. I think that there's still a sense that we're not quite out of the woods yet, and that's probably a correct one. One thing that I'm worried about is the rising number of variants of concern, specifically the Brazilian and Indian variants that we've seen in Saskatchewan. We only had a handful of the India variant, for example, earlier this week. Now we have close to 30. We have 29 as of yesterday. And we've seen the number of the Brazilian variant also kind of creep up from, again, a handful last month Now we're looking at, I think, over 120 cases that have been identified by genome sequencing. Those two are especially bad news. So the question really is the vaccination campaign going to be able to keep those in check? Are people going to keep following the measures once we get to May 30th? Are we going to come out this thing okay and preserve that capacity in Saskatoon? All things to be seen.
Oh, we're getting close to the end of this. So I'm going to end this with what amounts to a pretty crass question to Arthur, because it has political elements, but it has the morbidity element to it. We know that deaths are significantly down from where they were in January, where they were in February. It is related to the vaccinations. We know that that's playing into the reopening strategy here in Ontario and Alberta and elsewhere. I guess the question that needs to be asked beyond this is this ultimately the win for Scott Moe and the other premiers to see vaccines come in large numbers, and whether it's first dose or preferably second dose, they do seem to be preventing a lot of the morbidity that we were seeing earlier. Is that the win that, politically speaking, the premiers are hoping for? A lot of people don't like that because people are getting very sick, as Zach mentioned, and it's no easy healing process in COVID. But from a political standpoint, they do point to the fact that we are not seeing a death or two a day, maybe, and that is being judged as an effective win for them right now. Is that pretty much the case in terms of what you're seeing in terms of as applied to the reopening strategies?
Well, yeah, I mean, it certainly makes it easier to move forward and to make these plans palatable when the province isn't having to respond to tragic stories about multiple people dying every day. We're still seeing deaths, absolutely, but we're not seeing the kind of numbers that we saw during the fall and winter. So that makes it easier for the province to move forward. And ultimately now, I really think that if this goes according to plan, and that's still a big if, as Zach said, there's still a lot of variables here. But if the province is able to reopen in early July, I think that Scott Moe is going to get a boost from the sense of optimism and the economic rebound that's likely to bring. So again, it remains to be seen, but I'm sure that's what he's hoping for.
Well, whether we're winning the race, we're reopening anyway, and that seems to be the reality in terms of the race between the variants and the vaccines. Guys, this was a great talk. I covered a lot of area today. Thanks so much for all the research you guys have done, because I often learn stuff from these conversations, and I learned a lot today. So, Zach, Arthur, thanks so much for doing this, and I guess next time we talk, we'll be a lot more of an open province, won't we?